Okay, welcome everyone. Um, I hope that everyone is doing well on this Monday and staying safe and healthy. Um, Thank you for joining. March has proven to be a great month to have a webinar series. This is our third webinar in a series of 5 every Monday in March. And today I'm really excited. We're going to be hearing from the Wisconsin Wetlands Association. A couple of housekeeping things. If you're a crop consultant listening in today and hoping to earn CEUs from this webinar, please type in your full name into the chat box and we will get your credits recorded. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the Discovery Farms website. My name's Erica Olson, and I'm the Farmer Network and Communications Coordinator here at Discovery Farms. I'll share my screen just to do a quick Discovery Farms intro, and then we'll get started. Note, there is a poll going on. Hopefully everyone can see that. So if you answer the 3 questions in the poll, it will help us know who's here and kind of shape what the Wetlands Association is going to talk about today. So I've started sharing my screen. This is the Discovery Farms website, and we are a on-farm research and outreach program, part of the University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension. And we are a statewide program. We focus on the relationship between agriculture and water quality. So we have research going on throughout the state. I encourage everyone to visit our website if you're curious about our program. Here, if you click on the On-Farm Projects tab on our website, we have a full list of the suite of projects we are currently working on and some of our past projects. So you can click in on those and learn more about our research. We also have this tab up here called For Farmers and Advisors, which is most of our publications and research resources and data fact sheets. It's a good place to look if you want to learn lots about water quality research and what we found. And also, if you want to see the other webinar recordings, I'm posting them on our website on this events page here. If you click in, you'll see where those previous recordings are and also where this recording will be posted. So with that, I will pass the baton over to the Wisconsin Wetlands Association. Today we have Erin O'Brien and Tracy Hames with us, and they'll be talking about the role of wetlands in Wisconsin watersheds.
Thank you, Erica. Let us just get our presentation up here. Is that coming through okay for everybody?
Looks good, Erin.
You seeing, okay, you're seeing not presenter correct?
I see a white slide.
Perfect.
I did see, yep, perfect, okay.
Okay, and let's just leave that poll open for 1 more minute. But yeah, thank you all for joining us today. My name is Erin O'Brien, and I'm the Policy Programs Director at Wisconsin Wetlands Association. And here with me is Tracy Hames, our Executive Director, who's going to be our main educator today. Just wanted to give a few minutes background on us. We're a non-governmental, nonprofit organization dedicated to helping landowners and communities understand how wetlands can be used as solutions to water-related issues. We do have a website, wisconsinwetlands.org, if you want more information about us and wetlands. And we'll be providing some contact information for all of you at the end of the webinar. So just a little bit on our background as your hosts today, co-hosts, I should say. Both of us have been working in the wetlands world for too many years to count. I've been with Wisconsin Wetlands Association for about 15 years. Tracy, you want to say a word or two about yourself?
30 plus years. I've done a lot of work on the ground intensively agricultural areas. So a lot of work with farmers and on-farm restoration and long-term management of wetlands and uplands and floodplains and cropped areas, grazed areas, et cetera, et cetera.
Great, thank you. So we'd like to just real quick go through our goals for the webinar today. The first is a learning objective goal to help increase participants' understanding of basic wetland and hydrologic processes, how on-farm management is tied to watershed concepts or what's going on around you, and how wetlands can help address both on-farm and watershed scale issues. Keeping with the theme of this webinar series, of course, we'd like to help address some common wetland misconceptions and also build interest in using wetlands as solutions to water management issues. And then finally, and very importantly, we're looking for some input from you between this webinar and the one that we'll be hosting next week on what your wetland data training or technical support needs may be. We're hosting this event with a collaborative grant we received from EPA, and it's a program development grant. So the information we get from you in response to the polls and the chat questions, both this week and next, are really going to help our discussions with UW Extension on how we might meet some of those programming needs. So a little bit to just set the stage on wetland myths. We know that there's a lot of concern and confusion about wetlands on the landscape, and in a lot of places we hear the sentiment that either you just can't touch them, you know, don't even bend a blade of grass so you'll get in trouble, and that wetlands are incompatible with agricultural lands. And we're really hoping through this, the presentation today, to assure you and provide some additional perspective on how wetlands can be very compatible with agricultural lands. There's also a lot of perspective and maybe some history with some of the wetland restoration programs that restoring wetlands requires loss of farmland or taking land out of production and affecting your bottom line. And what we really want to talk about this week and next is how wetlands can be integrated into working lands and into your operations. And then finally, the idea that wetlands are only good for wildlife. While it's certainly true that wetlands are very good for wildlife, what we'll talk about more today is the other water management functions that wetlands can provide.
Let me interrupt for a minute.
Yeah.
I want to make sure that people are able to see the screen. I've got a message here from someone that says it's just a blank white screen.
Yeah, is there slides?
We had it.
Still white.
We see them on our screen. Is that better?
Oh, there, yep, you're good.
I'm so sorry, everyone. Well, the good news is those were just talky slides. I think, it in presenter view, and I guess that wasn't showing. Okay, thank you, Tracy. So, real quick, last thing we'll say, you know, when we're talking wetlands and farmland, there's always an elephant in the room. We know that wetlands, you know, that wetlands can be scary. They can sow confusion about what you can and can't do with your land. They can breed resentment among agricultural landowners. So, you know, we understand that wetlands increase regulatory scrutiny, and we want to be upfront about, you know, that we recognize that as a large concern. It's not the focus of this webinar. We're not going to be talking about the ins and outs of wetland regulations or even taking questions about the ins and outs of regulations, but we wanted to just acknowledge that you may have those kinds of questions, and invite you, if you do, to enter them into the chat at any point along the way, so that we at least have that information to think about what we might need to address in future programming. Okay, so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Tracy.
Thank you. So let's start with the basics. What are wetlands? We always have to start with this.
Oh, actually, I'm so sorry. We should close this poll. And I'm just going to move. Are you guys seeing that?
I'll share the results now.
Okay. So we've got good diversity from around the state. Majority of folks are working in row crop systems, but still diversity with other systems. And okay, lots of water quality, agricultural water management. Okay, thank you, Erica. That's helpful to us.
Yep, I'll stop sharing.
Okay. And let's move that poll out of the way if we can. Okay, are folks' screens clear now?
Looks good, Erin.
Okay, thanks.
All right, so we're back. So let's start with what are wetlands, just to get everybody on the same page.
Why isn't that working? There we go.
So oftentimes when you talk to wetland scientists, they'll give you long, detailed definitions of what a wetland is, involving water, soils, vegetation, a lot of other things. But for the purposes of today's webinar, you really need to know one thing. Wetlands are those features on the landscape that occur in between the places that are always wet and the places that are always dry. And because of this, we have many varieties of wetlands existing on the spectrum of wetness and dryness. Some wetlands are closer to the always wet end, and some are closer to the always dry. And there's many variations in between. So be thinking about that. We're talking mainly about wetlands in terms of water management. So that's our working definition for this webinar. So let's start out by reviewing the diverse types of wetlands we have here in Wisconsin. Marshes and deep water wetlands. When most of us think about what a wetland is, in our brain pops a picture similar to this. We think of an open water area with cattail fringing around it and lots of ducks, or in this case, egrets or other things on the water. Those are important wetlands, but that is just one. Marshes are just one piece, one component of a diverse array of wetlands in Wisconsin. So let's look at the other types of wetlands here. Sedge meadows and low prairies. These were some of the most abundant wetlands in the now agricultural portion of Wisconsin during historic times. These incredibly important wetland types provide most of the water management benefits we will be talking about in this webinar. Floodplains and floodplain forests. These occur along our rivers, creeks, and streams. They're seasonally inundated each spring and during high precipitation events. Some have trees and some do not. If you have a waterway running through your property, you'll want to understand how floodplains work and what condition yours is in. If the river is causing lots of erosion, that's a problem. We'll be talking a lot about floodplains in this webinar series. Forested wetlands, or the true swamps. We use the term swamp oftentimes for a lot of different wetland types, but real swamps have trees in them or wooded vegetation in them. And there's a great diversity of wooded swamps in Wisconsin. Shrub thickets. Shrub thickets exist along lakes, rivers, and stream shorelines. Usually it's alder or willow or dogwood or other things. Very important for habitat and for helping address erosion issues along your waterways. Fens are spring-fed wetlands with some very unique characteristics. These wetlands were most common in what is now the agricultural portion of Wisconsin. You may have spring-fed wetlands on some of the lands you manage. Bogs exist mostly in the northern forested portions of the state. We show them here to help demonstrate the great diversity of wetland types we have here in Wisconsin. Okay, ephemeral and seasonal ponds. Ephemeral ponds are some of the least recognized wetlands on our landscape because they normally dry up for a good part of the year. The 4 photos here show an ephemeral wetland during various times of the same year, going from upper left through bottom right, starting in the spring, moving on to the fall. So you'll see that they hold water in the spring from snowmelt and the spring rains, allow the water to either slowly be released or soak into the ground later on. By late summer, they're oftentimes dry. The wetlands in this photo are wooded, but you'll notice on a lot of agricultural areas, there's a lot of these types of wetlands as well. We often call them seasonal wetlands. These wetlands are incredibly important for their water holding, nutrient processing properties. They make up many of the upper watershed wetlands we will be referring to later in this webinar. And of course, the working wetlands. As we mentioned previously, a common myth or misconception is that wetlands and agriculture don't mix. Other features that should not be touched, let alone farmed or grazed. These myths cannot be farther from the truth. Wetlands should be important features of all healthy working agricultural landscapes. The wetlands we'll be talking about in this webinar series are those that fit within a working farm and agricultural landscape. We'll be talking about how these working wetlands can provide water management benefits at both the watershed and on-farm scales.
Okay, so Erica, we have a poll question number 4 that we can launch here. Thank you. So let's just take a minute. We'll watch the responses and we'll close as soon as we've got a pretty good chunk. So please take a moment. How much is your current work informed? Oops, that's the wrong poll, Erica.
Do you want me to, which one?
Yeah, it should be, please rate your current level of knowledge on the role of wetlands and watersheds.
There we go.
Sorry, y'all. We're using new technology, and we've all, of course, been out of the office with this health thing. Answers are coming in really, really quickly. Thank you all for participating. We'll give it about 15 more seconds or so. Please rate your current level of knowledge on the role of wetlands and watersheds, how wetlands manage runoff, and the benefits that provides. Okay. Eric, I think we can close the poll. Tracy?
All right, next slide.
Okay, thank you all. I think I can stop sharing that, okay.
So what we want to start out with a watershed perspective. So the question is, why should agricultural land managers understand watershed hydrology? And our answer, of course, is because water flows downhill, simply as that. What others do on their land above us affects us. What we do on our lands affects those below us. So collaboration among neighbors is crucial when you're working upstream and downstream from folks. So to understand how to manage water on farm, we need to understand watershed processes. And we'll see that wetlands are important managers of our waters. And now there's a time for another poll.
Yeah, so Erica, if we could please launch the poll about watershed considerations. So it's question 6. Thank you. How much is your current work informed by watershed considerations? For instance, what's happening upstream or downstream from the land you help manage? How much are you all thinking about that in your, oh, we have these, the poll looks like it's closed, Erica.
That was the one that was opened earlier.
Yeah. If we can't reopen the poll.
Not sure I can reopen it.
Okay, let's just move on then. Thanks, y'all. We'll try to capture that in the post webinar evaluation poll. Okay.
Don't click the slide yet.
Okay, go ahead.
So we're going to show a video right now that kind of gives some basic concepts on how wetlands help manage water in a watershed perspective. So enjoy this short video.
Hang on.
Do you remember fishing with your grandpa, catching frogs at the water's edge? Some of these precious childhood memories of nature tie back to wetlands. Wetlands occur between the places that are always wet and the places that are always dry. Not only do they give us great memories, they also protect the health and safety of our communities. They reduce flood damages, help keep our waters clean, and ensure we have water to drink and use in our businesses. But the ability of wetlands to provide these benefits depends on how we use and manage our land and water. Across much of the state, the changes we have made to our landscape have disrupted this ability. And as a result, we're seeing more flood damages and water quality problems. The good news is that wetlands can be an important part of the solutions to these problems. And by understanding how wetlands work, we can begin the exciting process of restoring wetlands to help heal Wisconsin's waters. Because water flows downhill, we can't fix issues downstream if we don't fix problems upstream. So let's start at the top and look at how it's all connected. The watershed. A watershed is an area where all surface waters, lakes, rivers, streams, and wetlands, drain to a shared body of water. But wetlands in different parts of a watershed manage water in different ways. Wetlands in the upper parts of a watershed form in low spots on the land. These wetlands capture, store, and slowly release runoff from rain and snowmelt. They may not always look like wetlands. They're wet in spring and dry by late summer, and often they don't even appear to be connected to streams or rivers, but they are critical. Here's how. Individually, these wetlands may be small, but they can be locally abundant. Together, they hold and manage a lot of water and literally slow the flow, allowing the water to soak into the ground. This reduces erosion and flood peaks and helps protect downstream roads and neighborhoods. Wetlands in the middle part of a watershed form along rivers and creeks, giving them room to swell during high water. They are most commonly known as floodplain wetlands. When floodwaters spread out across a floodplain, they slow down and spread out. Slower moving water has less erosion-causing energy, and water that can spread out means lower flood peaks downstream. Wetlands in the lower parts of a watershed form where rivers empty into larger bodies of water, especially lakes. Where rivers flatten out, the current disperses and the river drops its load of sediments and other material. This makes the water that enters the lake cleaner and clearer, which means better fishing, swimming, and boating. So are the wetlands near you healthy and abundant enough to support watershed health, or are they too damaged to do the work you need them to do? If you don't know the answer, you're not alone. But if you're concerned about water quality and flooding and care about fish and wildlife, encouraging your community to explore how local wetlands are or are not supporting watershed health is a great place to start. Working together, we can use wetlands as solutions in our communities. And at the same time, we can ensure that our kids and grandkids create the same treasured childhood memories we hold dear.
Okay, thank you for sitting through that. We have one last poll we'd like to do before we move on with the rest of the presentation. So Erica, this is the one on the information in the video. So the question is, to what degree was the information in the video new to you? That's the poll that should be up, Erica. There we go. Okay, we'll just give this a few more seconds. Looks like we've got a nice response. Thank you all. Okay. Thanks, Erica. Okay, so here we go. Oops, sorry. Oh, man. There we go.
Okay, I'm back. So let's review very quickly. It looks like a lot of you are thankfully knowledgeable about wetland processes. So a lot of this today will be a review, but we'll be talking specifically about the wetland components of watershed and water movement. So let's review. Different wetland and landscape features occur in different parts of the watershed. In these webinars, we'll be focusing our attention on upper watershed wetlands and floodplains because these are the areas most important for hydrologic restoration and management in agricultural landscapes. Generally speaking, 80% of the water entering and running off our lands occurs in the upper portions of our watersheds. Because water flows downhill, alterations occurring upstream have downstream consequences. Loss of upper watershed storage and disconnection of mid-watershed floodplains creates flashier flows, higher energy runoff, and increased erosion, nutrient transport, and sedimentation. So watershed characteristics can be very different between different watersheds. Some watersheds are flat, some are steep, some are large, some are small. But it's important to understand that the physical and hydrologic processes governing how water moves through different types of watersheds all follow the basic principles. Here's an example of a glaciated watershed. In glaciated areas of Wisconsin, the land can be pretty flat, as we know. And sometimes it's difficult to even know if you're in an upper portion of a watershed, or middle portion, or lower, because of the way the landscape looks. In contrast, the other extreme is driftless area watersheds in Wisconsin. In the unglaciated driftless region, the landscape can be very steep, and it's easier to see what portion of the watershed we're in. Waterways here, to me, look like varicose veins. They're draining steep hillsides. But as we said earlier, the basic hydrologic principles applied to both of these watersheds. In both of these watersheds, upper watershed wetlands capture and hold water. The water is slowly released as surface or groundwater flow. This flow spreads out in mid-watershed floodplains, and it ultimately ends entering a lake or larger river. So where you are located in a watershed is important to how you think about wetlands and water management on your farm. In part 2, we'll discuss a little bit about how you can determine where you are located in your watershed. Now, the upper watershed wetlands are the first line of defense against unregulated runoff. Unfortunately, these wetlands have been lost at a greater rate than most all other wetlands in Wisconsin. So as a result, in most watersheds, especially agricultural watersheds, water moves earlier in the spring and much more swiftly downstream. This results oftentimes making the upper watershed areas drier ultimately and lower watershed areas wetter than they were historically. Upper watershed wetlands also make excellent pasture and hayfields. They're important for recharging shallow aquifers, keeping root zones sufficiently moist in late summer. In this photo, the grazed upper watershed wetlands are near Somerset in St. Croix County. This area, incidentally, is also excellent waterfowl habitat. Okay, middle watershed floodplains. Like upper watershed wetlands, Wisconsin has experienced large amounts of floodplain disconnection and floodplain wetland loss. Channelization, levee development, channel clearing, sediment deposition, and flow restrictions such as dams and road crossings have all contributed to channel incision, disconnection of floodplains, and loss of floodplain function. Floodplains, as you may know, also make excellent pasture and hay fields. The healthy floodplain in this photo is in La Crosse County. This is one of the few remaining intact floodplain wetland systems in the driftless region, by the way. Okay, wetlands reduce energy. Reducing the energy of runoff is one of the most important benefits of wetlands in an agricultural landscape. We can't emphasize this enough. Gully formation, soil loss, channel erosion, channel incision, and most other water-related issues can usually be tied directly to an increase in runoff energy. So as you consider wetlands in your on-farm planning, it's helpful to be constantly thinking about energy. We will be repeating this concept several times over the course of these 2 webinars to make sure it sinks in. So if you have runoff issues, look upstream for potential solutions. In this photo from Bayfield County, wetland loss upstream from this wetland site overwhelmed the water management capabilities of this wetland. The result is deep gully formation moving upstream into this wetland. And by the way, this gully formed in one rain event once the wetland got overwhelmed. Wetlands improve water quality. A lot of you folks, according to the polls, are doing a lot of work in water quality management, so that's great. So let's talk a little bit about sediment and nutrients in wetlands. As was stated earlier, Extension's Discovery Farms program has been studying runoff management as it relates to sediment nutrient movement for many years. They've got a lot of helpful information, so seek out the information from the Discovery Farms studies and programs. Basically speaking, if we can control the flow of water during snowmelt and runoff events, we can improve our water quality. And we've seen how wetlands capture runoff. An upper watershed wetland like this reduces nutrient peaks downstream. Yep. Wetlands reduce sediment loads. Often when the subject of wetlands and water quality comes up, most of the discussion revolves around what is termed treatment wetlands. Treatment wetlands are artificial features constructed to address a specific nutrient or sediment issue. Though they may be useful features in some situations, we are not talking about treatment wetlands per se in this webinar. We're going to be addressing working wetlands that help look at the landscape's ability to manage water. The two photos here were taken at the same time on either side of a roadway during a runoff event in near Sheboygan area. The runoff on the left is coming directly off a cropped field, and the water on the right is filtered through a wetland at the bottom of the cropped area before it moves into the ditch. Wetlands reduce nutrient loads. Wetland plants and microorganisms in wetlands process nutrients in suspension, and the wetland basins themselves capture the nutrients bound to sediments. As an example, we're learning a lot now about how incredibly important wetlands are to managing nitrates at a watershed scale and on-farm scales. Here's a quote from a recent study of wetlands and nitrogen. Under moderate to high stream flow, wetlands are 5 times more efficient per unit area at reducing riverine nitrate concentration than the most effective land-based nitrogen mitigation strategies. These include cover crops and land retirement. So the location of wetlands is key to their effectiveness of handling nutrients on farm and at a watershed scale. We'll talk more about wetlands, their location, and nutrient management in part 2 of this webinar. So we've talked a bit about some basic wetland and watershed concepts. So now let's pivot and talk about what's happening in Wisconsin. Historically, Wisconsin was a very wetland-rich state. Wisconsin had more than 10 million acres of wetlands during pre-development times. That's like having 1 wet foot for every 3 to 4 steps taken. And over the years, we've changed the way water flows across our landscapes. This has been done through urban development, transportation infrastructure, upper watershed conversion, drainage and channelization, wetland and floodplain loss, and continuing with climate change. To create our modern landscapes, we had to make some drastic changes very quickly in Wisconsin. So in a very short period, hydrologic alteration made possible our vibrant cities, healthy agricultural communities, efficient transportation systems, and more. But to accomplish this, we removed half of our original 10 million acres of wetlands. We channelized our waterways, dammed our rivers, levied off our floodplains, clear-cut our forests, converted our grass lands, and poured concrete over a lot of our state. The photo on the left, incidentally, in this past right there, is the actual dredge they used to drain Horicon Marsh. They lived on that dredge. It was so big. So with the changes that we've instituted over the years, with these changes come challenges. As with all good things, our alteration actions have created challenges. You can't expect to conduct this amount of hydrologic alteration this quickly without experiencing challenges. So let's review some of the issues that we're facing now due to the alteration of our waterways. Our communities are flooding. Our rivers are running dirty. Incidentally, these 2 photos were taken 45 minutes apart during April of 2014. They show rivers in 2 adjacent watersheds in Bayfield County. The photo on the left has intact watershed wetlands, upper watershed wetlands. The photo on the right does not. Some of our waters are drying up. So when there are no more wetlands to hold snowmelt and spring runoff, our annual water budget can get used up when summer and fall rains come. It's like pouring water out of a bucket. We can pour it out all at once, or we can allow it to slowly trickle out over time. Watersheds work the exact same way. The same amount of water treated differently can produce some very different effects. Work by Wisconsin Wetlands Association and our partners in the Little Plover River watershed, for instance, is showing the importance of this. We'll talk more about that work in part 2 of this webinar. Oh, and by the way, this photo is not from the Little Plover River. Okay, our lands are eroding. Once again, upper watershed wetlands capture runoff and lessen gully formation. Gully formation is a significant source of soil loss, as we all know. This photo was taken at the top of a watershed in Grant County. Once again, the wetland upstream of this gully had been altered and is no longer effectively capturing runoff. And the problems then cascade all the way down the hill. Of course, our watersheds are collapsing. You've all seen this historic photo from Coon Valley, Wisconsin. This is the photo that launched the Federal Soil Conservation Service, which is now the USDA. It's really hard or impossible to put this level of damage back together. And our communities are suffering. Road washouts are occurring more and more frequently in Wisconsin. They're dangerous and they're disruptive, and they're a huge economic burden to landowners and local communities. We can't get our milk and our produce out if our roads are broken. So why are agricultural landowners important for water management? Our answer is several things. Because farms occupy something like 40% of Wisconsin's land base. Because our agricultural landscapes have been impacted especially hard by these hydrologic alterations. So if we're going to restore the health of the waters of our state, our watersheds and our private lands, the agricultural community must play a large role. Wetlands can be solutions to the watershed scale and on-farm water management issues we face in agricultural landscapes, more so even than in other areas. And it's not an either-or situation in agricultural areas. We can and must have wetlands on the landscape in a manner that helps manage the water flowing through our farms and our watersheds. As we always say here, wetlands are not the only solutions we need to apply to in our agricultural landscapes, but we can't heal our waters without them. And landowners are the key. Another myth that is common is that most of our wetlands, people think most of our wetlands are protected on public lands. This is far from true. 75% of Wisconsin's wetlands are on private ownership. And 85% of the lands that were wetlands that could be brought back, restored as wetlands, also are on private land, private ownership. And when you look at it, agricultural landowners know their land and water resources more than anybody else. Many of our farm families have been working the same land for generations. And we all know this to be true as well. Agricultural landowners care about their land and water resources as much or more than most everybody else. So farmers are really good at fixing their individual problems on their own land. But ultimately, we'll need not only that, but we'll need individual and collective action. We need to work together to heal the waters across our watersheds. If some of the problems happening on a farm are resulting from issues upstream, those problems can only be solved in partnerships with others. In my career, I've worked with a lot of agricultural landowners in a lot of places, and I've seen that the power in an agricultural community to come together shoulder to shoulder to, by God, address a common problem is one of the strongest forces on earth. So how do we turn all this stuff around? From our perspective, it's hydrologic restoration, literally fixing the way water flows across our landscapes. So let's review some of the big picture and take-home points. Now, we know we need to take a watershed landscape approach. And for decades, agricultural conservation programs such as Wetlands Reserve Program and a lot of other programs through state and federal agencies have practiced what we call random acts of conservation. So a grant program will be developed and advertised widely to whoever will be interested. Hey, we've got some money for wetlands. Who wants to sign up? With little thought or effort to prioritize where these actions should be taking place on the landscape. And also true for decades from a wetland standpoint is that wetland conservation has focused primarily on wildlife habitat. So when an agricultural program regarding wetlands comes through, they're usually advertising those for the wildlife habitat benefits. We're not going to fix our water issues unless we get serious about hydrologic management across our watersheds. And hydrologic management requires watershed scale work. We can't do this level of work without farmer involvement. And we can't expect farmers to engage unless it makes sense for them and for their operations. As agricultural landowners, you know the land and water better than anyone else and what might be right for you or your client's operations. The other thing is wetlands as solutions to these water management issues have not received the attention it deserves. Because of this, there's few support to do this kind of work or even examples to learn from at this point. We need to increase the use of wetland conservation to address our water issues. To do this effectively, we need to abandon the random conservation approach to wetland restoration. We need the right amounts of the right kinds of wetlands in the right locations. And we don't need hundreds or thousands of acres of wetlands back on the landscape to meet our needs. We need hundreds of thousands of acres across Wisconsin. And that's a big charge. So how do we get this amount of wetlands back on the landscape? From our perspective, it's all about viewing wetlands as solutions to the issues our farms and communities are facing. We need more understanding of why wetlands are important amongst our landowners and our communities. We need a new way of thinking beyond merely wetlands as wildlife habitat, thinking about them in the context of water management. We need wetlands as solutions. But to get the sheer amount of wetlands back on the landscape to heal our watersheds, wetlands as solutions must make sense on farm. So stay tuned. In part 2, we'll be talking about how some of the basic principles we reviewed today can be applied on farm. We'll talk about case study examples of watershed restoration approaches with strong farmer engagement. We'll talk about information from literature regarding wetlands and nitrates, and we'll be talking about and discussing your training needs and future opportunities that you all may need to move wetland management further into your operations.
Oh, look at that. Okay, so we're going to have to stop the slideshow in order to be able to view the chat box, but wanted to just real quick flip up some contact information. We'll answer as many questions as we can in the time we have remaining, but if your question doesn't get addressed or if there's something you want to talk about in more detail, please make note of our phone number and our general office line, and then we've got staff that'll triage your questions and make sure they get to the right folks. So I'll just take a minute in case anyone wants to jot that down. I guess this webinar will be recorded, so you'll be able to retrieve.
You can leave it up, Erin, and I can also read you the questions if that works better.
Oh, okay, that's fine if you want.
Yeah, sure. So if you have any questions to ask for Erin and Tracy, feel free to write those out in the chat box now. I have a question. If for someone who's kind of intrigued by this wetlands and wants to know about making like your first decision or first step into which acres to incorporate into the landscape, is there a specific place on your website or a good person to talk to about what your first step should be?
So this is Tracy. I'm always happy to talk to any of you with questions about specific on-farm applications or watershed-based applications to help get folks started on how to think about wetlands. I'll go back once again and reiterate, when you're looking at the perspective of water movement across the land, always be thinking about energy. Where is your energy being concentrated? Because that's oftentimes one of the greatest sources of a lot of the other woes that you're going to be having on farm. So always be thinking about energy and where you have opportunities to utilize wetlands to help slow that down, slow the flow, as we oftentimes call it.
We don't have any questions yet. A reminder again, if you are a crop consultant and haven't typed your name into the chat box, please do so. Another question for Tracy and Erin, as we've seen changes in Wisconsin in levels of groundwater with the precipitation we've received over the course of the last couple years, does that have a positive or a negative or no effect on current wetlands in the state?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we've certainly been receiving, in the last few years, whether it's climate change or whatever it is, we've been getting some of these very intense rain events, very localized in certain watershed areas where a storm will come in and just park itself maybe at 8 o'clock at night and drop a foot of rain, in 24 hours over one location. And we've seen all the problems associated with that, with the road damage and the soil erosion and the gullies formed and everything else. What we're finding as we're looking around the state in places that do have intact upper watershed and floodplain areas, even with these gigantic events we're having, we're able to minimize the damage from some of these storm events. And there's some real exciting things happening in certain parts of the state right now, up in the Ashland area and in the central part of the state as well. Now, when you look at wetlands and groundwater management as well, we're doing a lot of work, and we'll talk about that in part 2 of the webinar, in the Central Sands area. It isn't just, people have been concentrating on the irrigation, water removal of our groundwater resources and the issues that's presenting. But there's a lot of other issues that wetlands can be associated with as solutions to some of the groundwater management and the river and lake levels that we're experiencing now. So correctly applied, wetlands can not only solve the runoff issues, but help address some of the groundwater and the nutrient issues that we're experiencing in some of our agricultural landscapes. And we'll be getting into a little bit more specifics on that in part 2. Today was mainly, reviewing some of the basic concepts, so we're all working off the same page.
Good. We have a question. How can a farmer incorporate wetlands without taking land out of production? Many farmers can't afford to take their land out of production.
Right, and that's pretty much the number one approach we have to take if we're going to get wetlands, managing our water again, utilizing wetlands as a resource. It's got to make sense to the on-farm operation. We're never going to get to the scale that we need to get to if we're asking people to sacrifice their income or their operations to heal these waterways. So what we'll talk about is thinking about how water moves and the on-farm operations you all are working with. And in part 2 of the webinar, we'll be getting you to be thinking about, are there locations where wetlands can be utilized in places maybe where there isn't crop production happening right now? Or are there other ways? Maybe there are places where, as you're looking at a future movement, maybe there's places where you're actually losing money in some acreage areas, or thinking about, are there cropped areas where you're only getting a crop off every 3 or 4 years because of water issues or this or that. So those are the critical components that we want you to come away with after part 2, to give you a perspective on how wetlands may be incorporated. Of course, wetlands take land. You can't have a wetland without it being on the land. So you have to think about then, how can we maximize our economic benefits from our crop area, and how do wetlands on the land help with those challenges.
Great. Yeah. And a reminder, if you still have a question, we'll hang out for a minute or two. You can type it in the chat. Also, another request is if participants still listening, if you could share with us in the chat box what kind of information or data you are currently using to make decisions about what areas to crop, comparing inputs, financial, etc. You can feel free to share that in the chat box. Another side note is we will be sending out a survey post this webinar, and we hope you will fill that out. It'll include some follow-up questions from the Wetlands Association.
Erica, we had one more poll question that we accidentally skipped over that might also just help us understand the audience a bit for next time, and that was the question about how many acres of current or former wetlands these folks might be managing. Should we pop that up real quick since we've got a couple more minutes?
Yeah, let me find it.
And thanks so much to everyone for participating in these polls. We'd welcome feedback in the chat too on whether this was, you know, I know it's a little bit disruptive to the flow of information, but it is helpful to us as presenters and helpful to the evaluation of the broader programming we're working on. But how it works for you or whether it was useful for you is also of interest to us, of course. Here's the question.
Yeah.
About what percentage of the acres you own or help manage are mapped as wetland or have wetland history? For example, you know, they're drained or they're designated prior converted, or it's a farmed wetland or a hayed or grazed bottomland. So pretty good range. I can't see how many folks we have with us still. Oh,
30.
Okay.
Another question came in too.
Great.
Do farmers have any legal rights in getting their upland neighbors to do anything about controlling runoff?
Well, I'm not a regulator, so I can't speak to all of the laws. I don't know the answer to that question. I did see, it looked like maybe Dan Bauman was on the line at one point, if he's still here and wanted to take a crack at answering and unmuting and answering. While we're waiting, I'll say we can look into that question and get back to you, but we've sure seen a lot of good examples of where neighbors collaborating can reach those desired objectives. You want to talk to that, Tracy?
Yeah, and it goes back to the, you know, the community aspect, you know, in agricultural landscapes, how, you know, folks working together. Oftentimes there really is, when you have a shared vision of how water's moving across the landscape, people working together and coming up with creative ways of dealing with the water movement, because it does pass boundaries, goes from one farm to the next. As long as we're not feuding with each other, oftentimes we can, the solutions are much easier when we have several landowners working together that are connected to deal with the water issues that you all are facing in those watersheds. So, boy, collaboration and cooperation is some of the most important aspects of how you manage water on farm and in a watershed perspective.
And really looking for voluntary solutions because the regulations get sticky, right? Any other questions?
I don't see any other questions. A reminder, we will have Tracy and Erin back with us again next week to dive deeper into some of those agricultural landscape topics. So I encourage you to, if you're not registered for that one, feel free to do so. And hopefully we'll get another good turnout next week. I'm going to end the recording now, and